Good morning and welcome to SACAP's Social Media and Adolescent Identity webinar for teachers. I'm your host, Stephanie DeHaan, and I'm the Social Media and Events Coordinator for SACAP. Just a few house rules before we proceed. We will be having a short Q&A at the end of this presentation, so please feel free to send us your questions in the Q&A box, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen. We are aware that there's high internet usage in the country, thus slowing down internet connection in some areas. We also know that load shedding might take place at any given moment. So should you or our panelists be cut off due to this, kindly note that the recording will be made available to you by the end of next week. Please be advised that we are still working from home, so should you hear an occasional microwave beep or a child screaming, we do apologize. So, as an educator, you have an important role to play when it comes to helping your teenage students navigate their way through life. This is particularly challenging in a digitally saturated world. While it is widely reported that social media can pose serious risks, what is less spoken about are the positive roles that social media can play. So without further ado, I will now hand over to Dr. Jaclyn, who will tell us about the various forms of social media, the good, the bad, and the middle ground. Dr. Jaclyn, over to you.
Thank you so much, Steph. Thank you for that introduction. Morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for joining us this morning at SACAP Social Media and Adolescent Identity event for teachers. I feel very at home amongst this group. I come from a long lineage of teachers, and so I'm happy to be here with you this morning. I'm particularly grateful for your attendance. I know that it's been a long year. It's been a traumatic year for those of you on the front line of education. And it's a Saturday, and I also said to Steph this morning, I realized I'm competing with the Springboks. So I'm very grateful for your attendance here this morning. As Steph said, my name is Dr. Jaclyn, and I have the privilege and the responsibility of being the academic dean of SACAP. But what I most identify with is as a counseling psychologist and as an educator. And today I get to speak about a field of interest of mine and a passion of mine, given that as a psychologist, I've always worked with adolescents and children and families. So myself and another counseling psychologist, Michael McInerney, started speaking about this topic about 10 years ago, actually at a teachers forum in Grahamstown. And at the time, we were kind of on the younger edge of the spectrum of psychologists in Grahamstown. And so our colleagues kind of said, you take this on and you start talking about this. And I think why it worked well between Michael and I is because we had this kind of good cop, bad cop routine. He had a far more kind of positive and progressive view of the upsides of social media, and he'd also come back from a media background as well. And I had a more cautious, I wouldn't say fearful, but certainly a more cautious approach to him, a more conservative approach maybe. And so this good cop, bad cop routine worked really well for us. And I must say that over the years, I've probably moved a little bit more to the middle of the spectrum, less conservative. I married Michael, so maybe he's had an influence on my thinking over the years. But what I'll try and do today is just hold the middle ground in the conversation. So just moving on, I'm just going to ask you to participate quickly for me, and it's nothing threatening, don't worry. Before we get stuck into the theory, it's just good for me to get a sense of where the room is at. And usually when you do these talks face-to-face, you can quickly get a sense of the room. So I'm going to ask you in the chat to just type an A, B, or a C for me, and I'm going to tell you what those mean. So if you believe that social media has a place in identity development for adolescents, that would be A. If you're on the fence about the value of social media, that would be B. And if you wish that they would just shut the internet down, that would be C. So it would be good just to get a sense. Okay, there's lots of A's coming through. There's a C. There's a C. Good to see the honest C's coming through. A couple of C's, a couple of B's. Okay, nice to get a sense. All right. So it seems like the majority of the room are sitting at a, I believe there's a place, or a, I'm unsure. The ones around, I wish the internet would just shut down. You're certainly not alone. And I must say that when we spoke about this 10 years ago, that was where the majority of people were sitting at. The majority of people had a very fear-based response to what was happening online at the time. And what's interesting is over the years, we've seen a slight shift in that, but you're certainly not alone if that's where you stand. So just good to get us, yeah. Marissa says we cannot get away from it anyway. So just to give you a sense of what today is going to look like, just our outline for today, we have an idea of where people stand now. We'll start with a more kind of theoretical perspective, looking at our traditional, our understanding of traditional media and its influence on adolescent identity construction. We'll briefly look at the role of traditional media. We'll move on to identity construction in the time of social media. We'll look at the online stage as a way of understanding this identity development. We'll then move on to looking at a more practical route of the good, the bad, and the middle ground around social media. And I'll ask you for some input at that point as well. And we'll hopefully have some more kind of practical steps to walk away with. We have a few videos, and then hopefully we'll have some time for a Q&A at the end as well. All right. It's difficult to look at the impact of social media on identity without looking at how identity was formed or is formed even prior to the arrival of social media. So what you have here on this slide are just a few quotes that speak to a snapshot of identity construction before Facebook or before Instagram. And you can see that these quotes range from 1959 all the way up to 2011. And you can see that all the theorists are essentially building on what was said before. And I think you all as teachers would generally agree with what's spoken about here. So we've got Erikson, who says to us that adolescence is the development period where identity becomes the primary concern. Identity forms over time from the interactions between the individual and their social environment. And adolescence is a period when youth aim to foster their own autonomy via their identity creation, sexuality, and interpersonal intimacy. So I think these kind of stances have just built on what Erikson was saying right at the beginning. If we think about the traditional forces of influence in terms of adolescent identity, we would consider forces like our peers, our family, our school, maybe our church, if we're involved in church. And these institutions or groups had a strong influence on adolescent identity creation, particularly prior to kind of the influence of the media. And often these institutions had a very vested interest in adolescent identity creation, as the vested interest was a reflection of the same values as the one that they held, whether that was the family, the school, the church, our peers. So there was a real vested interest there. And I wonder how much of a priority this is for your schools and for your institutions today still. I know that my school's values were a very important part of my education. And my school was very active and deliberate in the strategies put in place in order to develop our identities as adolescents. And I guess the point that I'm just trying to make here very briefly is that as schools and as teachers, you are actively and intimately involved in the process of adolescent identity construction on a daily basis, whether you're aware of it or not. So at this stage, we've looked at traditional identity construction for adolescents, and this is something we've known about for a long time, and we've been theorizing about since, the days of Erik Erikson. And then before we move on to look at social media and identity construction, I think it's important to just stop and consider the roles of traditional media in identity construction. So if you'll indulge me, I'm just going to play a very short video. It's a little bit outdated, but it was actually, this video is one of the catalysts for my interest in this work with young adolescent women and media literacy about 10 years ago. So if we'll just watch this quickly and then we'll move on from there.
Younger, smaller, lighter, fuller, tighter, thinner, softer. It really works.
So I'm not sure how many of you have seen that video. It's quite old now. But I think what is depicted in this video, and it's part of a Dove campaign, is your more traditional forms of media. So think of print media, so your magazines, your billboards, or digital media in the form of TV, adverts, movies. That's what I'm talking about when I talk about the more traditional forms of media. And we may think of these forms of media as kind of the old guard. It's a very powerful and pervasive form of media. It surrounds all of us every day. It's the type of media that is geared at making us feel inadequate, unworthy, lacking. It's the type of media that tries to sell us products based on the flaws that they've convinced us we have. And the influence of this on adolescent identity development is very powerful. As we know, our teenagers are in a space of identity construction, and where their identity is not yet crystallized, as it may be for some of us. And the power of succumbing to these kinds of messages, we know how much these messages influence us. And so you can think of the power that these have on adolescent identity construction. But we have become wiser to this form of media. So its power is fairly widely acknowledged. We often use the phrase, don't believe everything you read. And it's very important in a world where there are no longer institutions that govern the production of media in the same way that they used to, for better and for worse. But it requires the consumer of this media to be far, far, far more critical. There's also evidence of shifting portrayals within this traditional media, the print, magazine, billboards, TV, as the marketing teams have started to understand that this unattainable idea of beauty, which is in that video that we saw, that unattainable idea of beauty is no longer convincing people as powerfully as it used to. And the marketers have also they've been shamed for their modus operandi of trying to sell people things based on making them feel inadequate. So I just want to show you another quick video. This is actually our last video. So if you'll just have a look at this one for me briefly.
One day, we won't need this day. We won't need a day to celebrate how far we've come. We won't need a day to prove we're just as fast or strong or skilled. We won't need a day to relive the comebacks, the firsts, or the titles we've won. We won't need a day to rally behind the ones fighting to change the rules. One day, we won't need this day at all, because one day, this day, will be our everyday.
So what you see in this, which is also another example of the traditional mainstream media, but an example, made kind of 11 years after that first one, is that we see a change in the representation of women in this video in particular, because it was about International Women's Day. And you see alternative representations of women's bodies. It's not just the skinny size 8 model bikini wearer representation of women. So we see alternative forms of body, but also gender identity in that video. And so that's really important, that the mainstream media shows these alternative images to young women and men now. I'd like to say that, the marketers have changed their tune and they've realized the wrongs of their ways. But the reality is that I think they've cottoned on to the fact that people are not okay with those old representations. And so they're using it from a marketing perspective. But that doesn't take away from the importance of seeing those alternative representations in mainstream media. So now the line between traditional forms of media and digital media and social media are blurred. But what clearly differentiates the two for me, and I think this is kind of the most important part for me, is the passivity associated with traditional media, in which the consumer of the media is passive and we're not actively involved in the creation. So we simply receive and consume the message that is intended for us. And in my mind, this is a much more detrimental form or it has a much more detrimental influence on teenagers' identity construction because of their passive role and because of their consumption of the messages that are just directed at them. But then we have this new kid on the block that's offering us something different. And this is where social media now comes in. And I just want to read a quick quote to you. It says, as adolescents seek to define who they are at the beginning of the 21st century, we're not at the beginning anymore, their forums for self-discovery have expanded. One place that adolescents now spend a considerable amount of time on is in online settings. And these online venues have been linked to identity exploration. So it would be useful for me, as we just move on to the next slide, for you to just on your own reflect on some of these questions in your own setting. Whether you think that there is a difference in identity construction over time since the introduction of social media, since the influence of social media has really escalated over time. Have you seen identities at your school change over time? Do you believe social media has had a role to play in this? Have you maybe seen a greater diversity in identities that your learners are taking on? And that's just something for you to reflect on your own. But let's have a look here in some of these quotes at what the experts have to say about social media and identity construction. So in our first quote, we see technology and online communication is currently ubiquitous for youth, particularly as a tool for socialization. I think our adolescents today can't even imagine a world without technology. And social media platforms have been part of their reality since the days they were born. They truly are the digital natives. If we look at that other quote, technology has become a central feature of identity formation by offering new contexts for social interaction and self-presentation. through the affordances of social media. Social media is a place where late adolescents experiment with their identity, and their identities are not yet fixed. Is that quote? And then the last quote, Vygotsky proposed that the tools of a culture, such as a telephone and a television, were essential for the development, And then Mango et al. Go on to describe social media platforms in terms of new cultural tools that have the potential to transform the construction of personal identities. So Vygotsky, back in his day, was speaking about the role of the telephone and the television. And what the theorists now are speaking about is the new digital tools that we have available for identity construction. And this quote always reminds me of some research that I read quite a few years ago now, but it basically traced back and it was anthropological research that traced back the panic and the kind of catastrophic reactions of parents at the time when the telegraph and the telephone were released. So it was kind of thought, when the telegraph first came out, the kind of panic was, this is going to change the moral fiber of society, that things will never be the same, and that, like this is the end of the world as we know it. And that was the telegraph. And then the same kind of happened when the telephone came out, and that was replicated with the TV. And then we've seen that replicated with the internet. But I think ultimately one of you said this earlier, the internet is here to stay, and social tools and social networking is also here to stay. And so really it becomes our responsibility to educate ourselves firstly, so that we can educate our youth. But I'll speak a bit more about that a little bit later on. So if we move on to the next slide, coming back to this idea of producers and consumers. So when we speak about those traditional forms of media, TV, magazines, we're talking again there about adolescents as consumers, and they have very little participation in constructing the messages that influence their identity construction. So what shifts for me in social media, and not just me, I mean, there's a lot written about this, is that our adolescents become producers and producers of content, and they're not just passive in their consumption of content. And what this means is that, in a sense, children, and it's not just adolescents, I mean, we can extend this to children, have gained a level of control that they didn't have before. My personal research area is very much focused on children acting as agents in seeking care in their own lives when they've lost their moms, in particular, to AIDS. And in a way, we're making a similar argument can be made here, in that in the past, adults kind of refused to acknowledge children's agency, or imposed on them this kind of idealized notion of innocence and purity. And adults were the one that were writing books about childhood or adolescence, or were taking photos with, expensive cameras, or were commissioning portraits of their children. And all of this kind of tended to commemorate childhood, to look back at childhood rather than to participate in it, which is what Nausicaa Renner of the New Yorker wrote about in 2019. So today, young people create images and put them into circulation without the interference of adults. And we'll speak about the pros and cons of that later, but you can just see the shift from a pure consumer of those messages. And what I like about the Dove videos, you almost have those messages flying at you. It feels like they're almost hitting you in the face. It's so visceral. And that with social media suddenly shifts, in that you're not just a passive consumer. that you have the opportunity to be a producer of media that influences identity development as well. So Eichhorn, I think her name is Kate Eichhorn, wrote a book about this in 2019, very interesting book. And she's saying that this practice can be hugely beneficial, this practice of producing content, and that new technologies like the smartphone have allowed us to produce narratives of our own lives, and we can kind of choose to remember and add to contribute to our own mythos, which is what kind of Freud has referred to it as. And the idea here is that even long before adolescents were able to create and edit and curate images of their own lives, they were doing this at a psychic level. So this is what Freud wrote about. And what's so interesting is Freud actually called this screen memories, not knowing really where we were going, but obviously quite futuristic in his thinking. And he said we use this kind of psychic level of editing memories to soften our painful experiences. And kind of humans have tried to cope with the difficulty of some memory, and trying to find ways to soften those memories. And I guess social media has just made us more adept at it. But it's not, it's not all positive. The fact that, our adolescents are growing up online means that there's this inability to edit memories in the way that Freud speaks of at a psychic level, because they're there in, on a smartphone or on a social media platform. And Eichhorn speaks about the fact that it's no longer the danger of the child's disappearance, but possibly the danger of a perpetual childhood, which is on social media. And the persistence of certain images that exist on social media are more problematic for some than others. But what's interesting is, even since she was writing about this, which was only 2-3 years ago, is that we've seen the rise of social media platforms like Snapchat or Instagram stories, because they kind of cottoned onto this idea of not wanting the permanence of images that we produce ourselves. And so with Snapchat and with Instagram stories, those videos disappear within a certain time frame. I'm not really on Snapchat, but I know that it's not ingrained in kind of history. It disappears over time. And so this almost gives us a little bit of a safer method of identity exploration. I think what also happens in these new platforms for identity construction that our adolescents are participating in is that they're not only exposed to the mainstream, they're exposed to a diversity of thought and a diversity of people. So there's this inclusion of diversity of culture and values and beliefs and appearances. And really what we see here is that children and adolescents are participating in their own socialization as they use social media. And I guess the critical question that we always have to ask is are they doing this in a critical or an uncritical way? If I move on to the next slide, I'll just take us back. I'm not sure how many of you remember these dolls, but there were these paper dolls and you got to cut them out, and you got to cut out the different outfits and the different accessories, and you got to try these on. And you can see this is very much influenced by the kind of more mainstream media, because you can see how perfectly skinny she is. But we kind of had these dolls as we were growing up. And if we were face to face today, I'd get you to play with these a little bit, just to take you back. But if I move on, I think just like the paper doll analogy, it might be useful to consider our online social media sites as something like an online stage. And the research backs this up. There's a lot of research written around this. So performing, and I use that word consciously because I'm talking about an online stage here. So performing our identity online could be everything from, trying out a different username in a chat room, to a fully virtual avatar in a virtual reality game. For example, Second Life. I'm not sure how many of you have heard of Second Life, but it's a completely virtual reality game where you produce your own avatar, and you can go into these different spaces within this. It's really a second life. It's like living out a real life online, but you've created your own version of yourself, I guess. And in a way, you're getting then to maybe experiment with an identity that you may not in a physical environment. So this performance of an identity online can really range on the spectrum. Like I say, it could be, just changing my name at the bottom of my picture here, all the way to something as extreme as Second Life. What's interesting is there's a lot of research that speaks about gay adolescents having a space online to experiment with to explore their identity in spaces that possibly have a more open world view. And so one of the theorists who wrote about this said, in a virtual world where flexibility and anonymity are possible, adolescents may feel more comfortable expressing their sexual orientation and exploring their sexual identity beyond social prescriptions. And where there was very interesting research on this that was done was in African countries where being gay is actually outlawed. It by law is not permitted. And so these adolescents who were struggling with their sexual identity didn't have a safe space. And when I say safe, I mean like a literal safe space to kind of get to grips with their identity as a gay young man. And so having an online platform in which to do this created a safer space for acceptance by people with a broader worldview. So in that last quote, they speak a little bit about it's like playing dress up. The anonymity afforded of youth within virtual worlds allowed adolescents more flexibility in exploring their identity through their language, through their role play, and through the persona they assume. And Erickson spoke about adolescence as a kind of moratorium. There should be a moratorium on adolescence where we get to explore, where we get to set ourselves, we get to move from this kind of like passivity of childhood and innocence of childhood, perhaps, and become kind of active explorers and creators and producers of our identity before moving into kind of the responsibility of adulthood. And I will come to the dangers of doing this online just now. I'm certainly not unaware of those. But I guess what I'm saying is just, we've had this very strong role of media that has been having a powerful influence on our adolescents' identity construction, generally in a very negative way. And we've now moved to this form of social media where there's opportunities for engagement with these platforms. But if I move on, you'll see my next slide speaks about the good, the bad, and the middle ground. There's always two sides to the story. And what I don't want to do is try and pretend that it's all positive, but I'm certainly not of the opinion that it's all negative. And along with the risks that social media brings, on adolescent identity development come a number of opportunities. But what I'm certain about is that the positives are not going to come on their own. If left unmediated, if adolescents are just left without any kind of educational mediation of these social media tools, then the negatives will outweigh the positives. And it's just, I'm not sure in your schools, but in many schools, media literacy has become a core part of the curriculum. It's become a core part of what parents and teachers are speaking to with adolescents about. And for me, although the type of media may have changed from traditional forms of media to social media, the role that education, which teaches us how to engage critically with these platforms, that stays the same for me, regardless of the type of media that we're talking about. So let's start by looking at some of the good that does exist, and some of the opportunities. And I think for me, you would have heard me say already that one of the most important positives is a sense of agency and a platform for voice of adolescents in their own identity development, and not just receiving messages from others. Social media provides a space for emotional connection with others, and this is all based on research. And I thought how important this was, particularly in the times of COVID, where we had long periods of time in the early days where we weren't physically seeing other people, where adolescents weren't seeing other people, and the role that social media played in ensuring an emotional connection with others. There's opportunities for relationships and friendships to be maintained over distance, and for new relationships to form, and for adolescents to meet people of diverse backgrounds. I think particularly of maybe adolescents who find themselves in very conservative situations, who may not fit in, who may not identify with their community, and who may feel completely isolated. And the ability to connect with somebody like-minded online can decrease that sense of isolation. There's quite a lot of research that speaks about the role that social media has played for adolescents who are transitioning from high school into university contexts, and how social media and the ability to stay in contact with old friends really lowered the levels of loneliness in that adjustment, and there was greater social adjustment. So that the role of social media in significant social transitions, I guess, is what I'm saying. Social media and the internet can be a safer space for socially anxious adolescents to practice relating to others, to practice their relational skills. And here the research quite clearly points out to young men and the benefits to young men of practicing relational skills in an online setting, which maybe feels a little bit less risky. It feels a bit safer than the kind of social exposure in a physical space, in a contact space. And you'll notice that I don't use the words in real life, because the reality is that social media and online is real life. It's just a different type of life. And so I'll speak about the physical or the contact versus the online, rather than, the real and the online. And I think that's important to notice, that it is real life. It's just happening through a different media. There are a number of support groups that exist online, and I'll talk about one in particular just now. And there's this space for emotional outlet for adolescents in these support groups. And then finally, there's the educational value for me, the ability to learn about others and learn about other cultures and multiculturalism and diversity, essentially. So I just wanted to give you the next the next slide, just to give you an example of a young man that has harnessed the power of social media for good. And Christopher is somebody that I met a few years ago now. He runs an NPO called Swim for Change, and this is actually just some screenshots of his Instagram account. And basically, Christopher is an open water swimmer. I'm not sure if any of you know of him. And I think when he was about 14, he was very young, he wanted to raise funds for boys at his school who couldn't afford school uniforms. And so he kind of started a campaign and raised quite a lot of money and got quite a lot of attention out of doing this good deed. And so then he saw that he had this platform for good. And he started to direct his focus towards mental health, which was something that he felt quite passionate about. And he started dialoguing with his peers about mental health on social media, on Instagram. And that was reinforced. People started to notice his work, both peers, but also adults and professionals like myself. I saw what Christopher was doing, and I reached out to Christopher to say, hey, how can I help? How can I get involved? And Christopher has been nominated for the Children's World Peace Prize, which meant that he then got exposed to an international audience. So his message has now not just extended to his peers and youth in South Africa, but he's now been exposed to an international audience. And he's kind of leveraged this, and he's got professionals involved, and he's running workshops, and he's writing, he's doing advocacy campaigns. Most recently, I saw that he actually spoke in Parliament about the Children's Act and the inclusion of mental health in the Children's Act. And I think, I'm a psychologist, and I think Christopher's done more for mental health advocacy in his very few years on this earth than I'll ever do in my career. But his identity as a mental health advocate has been reinforced by his peers and by adults who respond to what he's doing. And he's really leveraged the power of social media for the greater good. So I thought that's just one example that I wanted to share. But there's the bad, and we need to look at that as well. So we know that there is data accumulating around the negative effects of social media on adolescents. And there was big research released this week about Instagram and its influence on the mental health of young girls in particular. And although I've spoken about the opportunity for content creation, the reality is that research tells us that on average, the average teenager uses social media for communication and for content consumption. So even though there's this opportunity for production of content, they're using it mostly to consume content. And here we see the traditional media effects coming into play. So for example, Instagram is now so mainstream that traditional media has cottoned on and use it as an advertising kind of a stream now. And so if our adolescents are sitting on Instagram and they're merely consuming rather than creating, then they're getting the same impact as those traditional forms of media in advertising and the like. So the manner in which it's used is important. We know that adolescents can be more careless online. We spoke about the benefits of anonymity and the benefits of exploration, but certainly because there's lower risks, we can see a kind of greater carelessness. Research shows us that and this is about Facebook in particular, can have a negative impact on those who are already emotionally vulnerable. So those who are already emotionally vulnerable, spending a lot of time on Facebook, that can actually worsen the situation. And the impact of social media or the impact of the internet on depression differs depending on what our adolescents are doing on it. So there's strong evidence to show, if adolescents who are depressed are in chat rooms, socially engaging with others, there are big upsides versus kind of online shopping, which seems to drive them into a further depression. So what our adolescents are doing on these platforms has a big impact. And then there's something which they've termed Facebook depression. And actually what this is about is that adolescents kind of portraying a kind of negative, a kind of depressed outward portrayal, and then receiving a lot of kind of attention for that when they post kind of depressive status updates. And so they get attention for that portrayal of being depressed. And that kind of perpetuates the situation, even though they weren't necessarily depressed to start off with. So, and there's other examples there, kind of our youth not considering the long-term implications of disclosure on social media. I think we're all aware of that, the kind of putting something out there that, a day or two later, you think, wow, I wish I'd never done that. And then obviously the exposure on these platforms to people who have kind of sinister agendas. And I think that's where a lot of our fear sits. So I think online probably felt safer 15 years ago. And then the pendulum swung and there were all these horror stories. But I think the reality is that online is as dangerous as any other interaction. It's just in the physical world, we teach our children what to do or what not to do when they meet strangers. I think we need to do the same. We need to teach our children and our youth what to do when they meet strangers online. Because like I say, it's not the real world versus online, it is their real world. And so we need to be educating about how they behave in those situations. So just like, for example, if you're an adolescent girl and you are hooking up with your boyfriend and he takes his camera out, you would be skeptical. You would say like, hey, what are you doing? I think sometimes our adolescents don't necessarily think about the repercussions of these things happening online in the same way. And that's where we come in. So I'm aware of time, so I'm kind of going through this, but I think we're getting there. So what is a balanced view? What is the middle ground? And I'll just quickly read this quote to you. So young people experience both positive opportunities for social contact and negative cyberbullying effects when using social media. The current literature on social media suggests that youth experiment with their identities and self-presentation with others online, and that boys may benefit from social media use compared to girls who are more likely to experience negative ramifications, lower self-esteem. Given the centrality of social media in the lives of young persons, as well as the risks and benefits associated with social media use, it is crucial to continue to investigate the ways in which social media platforms can function as a setting for development in youth. I think it's important again to understand that's not either the face-to-face or the online environment. For adolescents, it's going to be both. It's both and. And it's interesting, there was some research that showed that adolescents don't perceive their interactions on social media as providing the same level of friendship quality as those in the physical or face-to-face environment, which kind of pointed out that level of communication or that understanding of interaction in the physical environment is not threatened by social media. Adolescents don't believe that they are the same. They understand the difference between the two and the need for the two. And I think, we with 4IR as our kind of reality, the rise of the machine is inevitable, but it's those who are going to learn, unlearn, relearn, those who are adaptable, It's those that have those who have those skills that are going to succeed in a world that is still largely unknown to us. So just in terms of this middle ground, I just want to share a quick story from my days in practice. And if we just move on to the next slide, I worked with a young woman who was, and this is many years ago now, who was very, very sick, who arrived at my practice with a very serious eating disorder and had a very strained relationship with her family. And so was in boarding school, didn't really have a relationship with her parents. And one of the ways in which she had become ill was through, I don't know if you're aware of these, but through these pro-ANA support groups. So pro-ANA basically stands for pro-anorexia. And she had used basically the internet and these social media groups around pro-ANA to become very, very sick, because these girls literally support each other in their sickness at the end of the day. And then through a process of therapy, so engaging, kind of really unpacking her past trauma, really working together, she started to get well. But where she found the greatest support, and we can look on at the next slide, was in the ANA recovery groups. So just as there are these pro-ANA groups, there are these ANA recovery groups, which is again a bunch of youth who are all in the process of recovering from their eating disorders, who really became her greatest supporters in her recovery, and who ultimately became her family in that time. So I guess I'm just showing you this as an example of the kind of, and we can look at the next slide as well, with examples of, these support groups on Instagram and the like. So it's really just to show you that there are these both sides. So I guess finally today, as we kind of start to wrap up, is now what do I do with this? Okay, so now we know all of this. There's the good, there's the bad, there's the middle ground. You're sitting with all of these ideas. What do I do with this? How do I take this forward? And maybe I'm going to share some ideas now as we go forward. And kind of on my next slide, I'm speaking about how do we ensure that the positives outweigh the negatives. And while I'm speaking, you really are the experts in this space. You really are the people working with these adolescents on what I call the front line every day. And some of you may have experienced some really positive ways of engaging with these media platforms with your adolescents that you work with. So as I speak, feel free to kind of give examples in the chat of some things that you've done as well that may be of benefit to others. So kind of go ahead if you'd like to. But moving on, perhaps I'm biased because I am in education. But for me, ultimately, at the end of the day, the outcome of all of this is about education. If we want to protect our adolescents and our youth from the risks that are inherent in social media, and to allow for social media to be used in ways that are beneficial and that will aid in their identity development, then we need to be tackling this head on. We need to be familiarizing ourselves with all of the information out there and educating our youngsters so that they can become what I call informed and critical digital citizens. So if we just look at the next slide, that speaks about this term of digital citizenship, and I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with it, but it's a term that's been used by educators and thought leaders and policymakers, and it refers to a set of skills that and behaviors that one must learn to be safe, responsible, and a respectful member of our 21st century online. So it's a set of skills and behaviors that we need to learn to be safe, responsible, and respectful members of our online community, just like we're trying to create, critical, engaged citizens of the world. We should be aiming to do that in the online world as well. And so Common Sense Media is a wonderful tool if some of you are not familiar with it yet. But how they define digital citizenship is someone who's able to think critically about the ethical opportunities and challenges of the digital world and make safe, responsible, respectful choices. And if you aren't familiar with Common Sense Media, I would just Google it while you're sitting there. You'll see that they have the most wonderful resources for parents, for teachers. They speak about things like media balance and well-being, privacy and security, news and media literacy, cyberbullying, relationships and communication. There's actual lessons that you can download there for free. That really speak to this. So do go have a look at them. They have this wonderful idea on the next slide of a digital passport. And this passport in particular was aimed at younger levels, at grade 3 to 5. But they've gamified this digital citizenship in that there's a number of games that you can play. And once you play these games, you're then awarded your digital passport. And once you have your digital passport, you're then able to engage in an online world because you've kind of passed your driver's license in a sense. On the next slide, you'll just see it's just another screenshot of some of the resources that are available, and you can literally go and get free lessons, as it says there. So I think just in closing, some of my other suggestions, and they're not just my suggestions, this is what research is telling us, but the core is around media and social media literacy. We have to, just like we teach our children kind of how to read and write and do arithmetic, we have to be teaching them the skills of media and social media literacy. It's core, it's critical to engaging safely in this world. It's not just youth education or teacher education, it's parent education. Parents have to get involved in understanding this world for their adolescents as well. Developing school policies that protect adolescents, and I've specifically said there, promote development. What we don't want to do is go to the fear-based school policies that try to shut this down, and then it goes underground, because the moment these things go underground, the risks become greater. So think about developing progressive school policies where we can leverage social media for a development tool. The four C's, so communication, collaboration, critical thinking, creativity. These are kind of the 4 C's around 4IR. So these are kind of the critical skills that are going to be required to function in this new unknown world. And this doesn't stop at adolescence. As we move into adulthood and young adulthood, those who can use social media in a sophisticated manner are going to have a head start in life. Think of better LinkedIn profiles, online networks, sanitized Facebook pages, although I don't think the kids are on Facebook anymore. But having that kind of head start in life because you've understood these social media tools is going to be critical. So we socialize online, whether we're adults or children. So helping to create spaces online that are safe and productive. Assisting adolescents to leverage social media. So I gave you the example of Christopher, but Greta Thunberg is a huge example of somebody who's used social media platforms for the greater good. Mindfulness around social media use and screen time. So you get things like an Instagram timer that can be set up on your Instagram, and it can tell you after so long, it kind of shuts down Instagram for you and says you've had your 3 minutes or whatever. And then building online support groups. So what was so interesting when my husband was a student and he was trying to finish his PhD, none of us were of assistance. Even those of us who'd kind of done our PhDs, like none of us knew what he was going through. We couldn't reach out to him. He was in a very dark space. And he found this support group called Finished, which was for PhD students. You can see it's a play on the word there. And it was this online support group that he was accountable to on a daily basis. He would put out his intentions for the day and have to account to the group. And that group played such a critical role in his completion, but in his mental health as well during that time. And then something that's not on the slide, but that's I've also been thinking about a lot more recently, is the kind of use of more niche social media platforms. So the moment that something becomes so mainstream, and I'm thinking about something like Instagram now, it gets adopted by the mainstream, and the traditional forms of media become more and more prevalent. So we start to see adverts in our social media feed. And so that kind of message starts to come in there. But there's also greater risk because of the audience size. So practicing your identity, there's greater risk in that size platform. So that's what I have to share. I realize that we are basically out of time. And I don't really think that we have time for questions at this point. But yeah, I just wanted to say thank you very much for your time this morning. It was wonderful to have so many of you here with us. But yeah, I hope that it's been some food for thought. It's a lot to take in, and I've kind of taken you all the way from kind of the days of identity development through traditional media through to social media. But I hope that you've seen that there are opportunities here, but that we have a responsibility to play in ensuring that those opportunities are leveraged, and ultimately at the end of the day, it's all around education. So have a look at, start with Common Sense Media. That's really my go-to as a starting place, but there's a lot about this being written in very critical and interesting spaces. So I hope that it'll be of meaning to you, and that you'll take something of this back into your work and into your lives, and perhaps with your own children. But yeah, just a very big thanks from myself and from Steph for being with us here today. Have a lovely Saturday further, and I'll just hand back to you, Steph.
Dr. Jaclyn, thank you so much for this presentation. And I think with the number of participants that were held, I think we were all quite, gripped by this information. So thank you very much. Dr. Jaclyn, if it's fine with you, seeing as we couldn't do Q&A, I will ask that anybody who does have questions, maybe just leave it in our Q&A box, and we'll get back to them next week. Is that okay? Awesome.
100%, yeah, absolutely fine.
So again, if you have any questions, you're welcome to use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen or the chat box. And Dr. Jaclyn will make contact with you next week. Once again, thank you so much for joining us and for staying through till the end. This recording will be made available for you for any of our future upcoming webinars. Please do follow us on our social media platforms, and have a wonderful Saturday further.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.